Okay, we're about to start again, please. Okay. So welcome back, everyone. We are here again for the third and last session of the FERMI Final Conference. In this session, we will discuss data as a key enabler for effective counter-information strategies. I'm Flavia Giglio. I'm a PhD researcher at the Center for IT and IP Law of KU Leuven, based in Belgium. And today I have the pleasure of moderating three speakers that are also representatives of three partners of the FERMI project. So we will hear from their very different experience in terms of collecting data for training purposes from different entities. So the first speaker that I want to introduce is Spiros Evangelatos. He's a senior researcher and innovation manager and head of pre-sales and net company based in Greece. He's an expert in explainability of machine learning and in complex bio-inspired network modeling and analysis. And in FERMI, he contributed to build the spread analyzer component, which is responsible for assessing the diffusion patterns of online disinformation campaigns. So I will, Spiros, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, Flavia, I can hear you very well. Can I share my screen? Instead of you sharing the slides. Let me check. How about now? Can you see my screen?
I'll leave you the floor. Tell us a little bit about how you collected social media data in order to build this FERMI component in particular, and what was your experience in the FERMI project?
Okay. First of all, good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be along with you together. I have to apologize, but this is a very hectic period for everyone since it coincides with an intense bidding phase for several EU proposals. So as the head of pre-sales for the Research and Innovation Development Department of Net Company, I couldn't be traveling to Berlin and, of course, be together with all the great colleagues that we have in the FERMI consortium. Nevertheless, I consider it extremely essential to contribute to the specific workshop, and I'm actually very, very glad for the virtual participation that allows me, as Flavia said, to provide a few insights on the data collected during FERMI, analyzed, of course, and all the barriers, let's say, that we faced during the project lifetime. So this is in a nutshell, okay, about the presentation that we have, the first one. Key challenges for us, it's we know how the disinformation goes. It's not, let's say, a newly phenomenon that we have faced. It existed from the early previous centuries with rumors in marketplace, propaganda in newspapers, and so on and so forth. But today, especially with the power that the digital tools have, all these kind of disinformation campaigns travel at the speed of light across billions of devices, and of course amplified by several algorithms, which most of the times, especially people who are not that technical, barely understand. It's not about, at least personally, what I see is not that disinformation is not about distorting facts. It can actually destabilize societies, and this is exactly what is at the heart of the FERMI project. And this is actually the main purpose that FERMI was developed as a project, and the challenge that addresses is how we can equip law enforcement, our end users, with fair, transparent, robust tools, digital tools, so as to analyze, monitor, and at the same time counter disinformation narratives effectively. Okay, this is the first challenge that we will start with. The key challenge that we faced during the project implementation phase, which was more or less on related to the data that we had to collect in order to analyze the phenomenon in an effective manner. So the biggest, sorry, this is okay. As you can see, there is a lot of data dependency in terms of the data that's required in order to have a real-time, high-quality access to social media data, which means that you have to draw data from different various social media platforms which have a completely diverse content, let's say, not only in terms of text, as it's most of the times in Twitter, X, actually the X Twitter, but also in terms of posts, metadata, and different network interactions. The something very interesting in terms of restriction to data access that we hadn't foreseen during the proposal development phase back in 2020 is that we had restricted APIs in terms of providing data from this, connecting to those APIs who were at the time then available for research purposes. And try to draw more data for the analysis of the phenomenon. So since 2019, if I'm not wrong, most of the major platforms like X, Meta, even TikTok these days have actually drastically reduced the data that can be accessed through the APIs. Okay, so all of us who belong to, let's say, to the research domain and the data scientists, of course, who had no longer any access on let's say, on the full stream of the posts that were uploaded on these social media platforms, nor for the interactions between the end users of the network or any metadata that were in a way essential to detect this kind of coordinated disinformation campaigns. Instead, most of the times we were left with some, let's say, partial or even curated data sets that, if you were trying to combine, they weren't telling the full story. So, in a way, at least in the FERMI project, we had the feeling that we were trying to solve a puzzle with half of the pieces missing. And this piece was actually the data. At the same time, what was also very interesting was the proprietary algorithms that were used by all the social media platforms, each one, of course, with their own proprietary algorithms that, in a way, try to amplify the content, but they remained opaque. Okay, what I'm saying is that even sometimes we do see the content, we don't know why some specific narratives and thus some specific posts spread faster than the others. So all this kind of recommendation algorithms in a way that lie behind the social media network and network actually seems like a black box to everyone. Uh, okay, this is something that we expect because they're owned, of course, by the platforms themselves. The bad thing is that since they do have this kind of arguments, they are the ones who decide what goes viral, what may stay hidden, and of course, which users are nudged toward which content. So this is something that hinders, in a way, the transparency, and most of the times, actually all the times, it becomes impossible to understand how the disinformation is amplified. At the same time, the platforms have also limited what data can be collected, stored, and at the same time analyzed. Even sometimes publicly available posts often fall under terms that prohibit the so-called large-scale collection. This means that all the researchers that we were involved in the FERMI who wanted to actually study the disinformation spread had our hands tied by any legal or contractual barriers, despite the so-called hot problem of disinformation, not only according to us, but also according to Gardner and to the United Nations as well. And at the end of the day, it was the GDPR and the privacy concerns that add an extra level of legal complexity, despite let's say, the very appreciated efforts by our colleagues in VUB and KUL, of course, including Flavia. So we had this extra legal dimension where user profiling and tracking of content was raising serious compliance questions under the GDPR. Okay, we all understand that privacy protection is extremely essential, but in a way it creates a tension. So saying in a way how we can balance individual rights, which we need when we need to detect and stop disinformation campaigns that might lead to online and offline crimes. Uh, that said, I think that we were caught in a paradox, which means that the more that we need the data to fight the disinformation, the harder for us is to get it. Uh, the technical barriers, okay, is that we faced as well. The data fragmentation. You can see that most of the social media platforms, they have different kind of data policies. Reddit is somehow relatively open. Instagram and Facebook are not. And it's not only the inconsistent access across all these platforms, but it's also the so-called multi-language problem in terms of different formats and languages and concepts more or less weigh the unified analysis extremely difficult. You know, when I say unified analysis, I mean how we can combine all these kind of elements and analyze them as a whole. Second, it was the so-called artificial intelligence and machine learning limitations. Since I think it was also referred by the panelists in the previous section that our models and all AI models actually are only as good as the data that we have to train them. Okay, so for example, apart from the let's say validity of this kind of data sets and completeness, sorry, not validity, the completeness of these data sets, it's also a part of the so-called English language heavy. So if we have some data sets which are English language heavy, I'm not sure that you can easily train your algorithms to try to detect coordinate campaigns in any other language. Extremely interesting as well is the lack of verified data sets of disinformation, which makes evaluating performance extremely hard. And when we say verified data sets, we mean that at least for all the data sets that we have, we wanted to also know the so-called ground truth, what is true and not. Finally, and this is something that we did not address in FERMI, but this is a great opportunity for the future project as well, is the emergence of the generative AI-powered bots today. And actually, this is how we also try to detect bots. We know that bots generate somehow fluent, emotional resonant, and in a way human-like messages. So the algorithm that you use for the bot detection was based on the text patterns or timing anomalies, which is not case in our case these days with generative AI is not valid enough. In a nutshell, what we are facing so far is the fragmented data, the biased training in a way, and the missing ground truth and all these kind of adversaries that have been armed with the generative AI mechanisms. These are somehow let's say, and these are the references that we have listed all the barriers and the technical difficulties that we have found. It would be nice actually to tell everyone that we tried, despite the problems, we tried also to activate even the Digital Act, right? But it was extremely hard to get data, real-time data from the X platform. X platform was the one that we were targeting from the beginning of the project. Okay, Mastodon was a very nice approach, but at the same time, it's an open source, but it doesn't have the virality of the X platform. So in a way, you can see that the conclusions that we can draw from Mastodon are not exactly not that wide applicable. What we did and what we actually tried from day one is to find all the historical data that might be relevant for the project, and at the same time we had let's say a subscription which was reasonably enough in terms of financial viability for all the companies, actually for all the entities that they might want to pay in order to get some of the data. And we try to build our evidence on this kind of even small data set that we were gathering. A lot of work from all the technical part side in order, to curate the data in terms of cleansing, analyzing, and so on and so forth, and provide at the same time something really tangible to the different technical partners to rely upon. Because FERMI, it's not about only actually it's not about collecting data; it's the analysis of the data that we have. So thank you very much for your time. I will be very, very happy if we have some questions.
Thank you very much, Spiros, for this presentation. I will actually kindly ask the audience to keep the questions for toward the end of this session. So in the meantime, all the speakers have enough time to briefly present what they've been doing in FERMI and the challenges they've been facing. So the next speaker, I would like to invite to the floor Michael Victor Lo Giudice. Is a PhD researcher in criminology at Transcrime, a joint research center on innovation and crime of Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Italy. He has a background in economics and political sciences, and his research interests mostly revolve around criminological phenomena that sit at the intersection between these two disciplines, including political corruption and information pollution. In the FERMI project, Michael contributed to develop the dynamic flows modeler, which aims at providing law enforcement authorities with an instrument to interpret how and where and when disinformation-inspired crimes occur in the offline world. So please.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Flavia. So as mentioned, my role in the FERMI project involves developing the dynamic flows modeler, which I'm going to go more into detail on the data and less on the model, but just so you understand the context of what we were trying to do. We were developing a deep learning model that could kind of provide insights on how crime would evolve. It was mentioned earlier today after a disinformation campaign circulated online. And to do this, obviously, the two types of data we needed was one on crime and then also on disinformation. With crime, we were rather fortunate. I should get closer to the microphone. Okay. Sorry, I move around a lot, With crime, we were rather fortunate because the project, of course, involved law enforcement agencies that were willing enough to share crime data. And, if you know about the training of machine learning models, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it requires very granular data that's extremely precise and accurate. And the police were able to provide that to us. However, when it came to the disinformation data, in the European context, we found there was not much available. And so indeed, while we were fortunate in terms of crime data, which, maybe we'll get into a little bit later, but in fact, I say fortunate for a reason, because usually at the European level, incident level crime data, a data set where each row is a crime, is not really available. So if you don't have access to LEAs through that kind of data, so right away you can't train a machine learning model. But let's say you're in our situation, you have it. Disinformation data in Europe is sparse. It's not really provided by any central authority. There's no one agency like Eurostat that's producing these data sets. It's kind of produced by researchers like myself or the others involved in European projects who, based on a specific need, you create the data set, like Spiros was describing they did for their component. But that means then taking it and applying it to future research or other research endeavors is difficult because it's kind of been, handcrafted for the task it was produced for. And so, for instance, we came across a lot of data sets that had a lot of instances of disinformation, stuff that would be great to study in Europe, but they didn't provide the dates when this disinformation was out there, because perhaps it was created by some professor who instead was looking into the content of the post and so didn't care the date. And so these are the types of challenges we encountered as we looked for disinformation from Europe. And indeed, we did not find a satisfactory set of data. On top of this, we have the issue of country-specific data sets. So disinformation is, of course, different in different countries. I mean, we heard today about the case of Sweden, about the case of Germany. It's not the same everywhere. But that being said, English content dominates, as it does in any data context. And it's also consumed in European countries. So it's a little bit difficult. For instance, if you find a data set that has German disinformation and they've focused on the German language, it's not totally representative because Germans are also consuming disinformation in the English language. And so it becomes difficult to draw the lines and say, okay, this data set is representative or is not representative of what people are consuming on the internet. And it is problematic also because you can think, for instance, in Albania, I know of a data set available for Albanian disinformation. It did not include dates, so we weren't able to use it anyways. They might be consuming disinformation in Italian because 1/3 of the country speaks Italian. But so when you're training a model, do you include Italian disinformation, which is likely being consumed by Albanians? It's difficult when you start, prying back the layers on disinformation to work with a data set. In the end, what we ended up doing was we went towards the United States, where we were more certain that the disinformation was being consumed in English. We had widely available data sets, and crime data is extremely accessible to the point where it's incredibly accessible. You can find the names of people arrested in Miami, Florida, and they tell you what they were charged with, when they were arrested, where they were arrested. And so we went to the United States and we trained the model in the US context. The important thing for us is that the model would understand the relationship between the two phenomena, and then we applied it into the European context. And of course, we had the crimes from the European LEAs, and so when the model actually works, it does its prediction studying how crime was evolving in Europe, and then with its insights on the relationship that it gained by studying the American context, it makes a prediction. So it knows how crime was moving in Europe, and it knows the relationship from this American context. But like I said, I want to talk more about the data, and I'll be brief here, but of course, afterwards, I think we'll take questions. So for sure, anybody who has more questions, that I would say the main challenge in dealing with this phenomena in terms of being a researcher trying to develop something like a machine learning model, or in general trying to study the phenomena, is there's no central source for this data. There is no Eurostat. There is no agreement on where to draw the lines and say this is data that belongs to country X, this is what people in country Y are reading or what they're viewing online. And on top of that, everyone's kind of thinking about themselves when they make the data. So everyone's thinking about my research project, and that means there's no large cumulative sets of data out there that you can kind of get your hands on. There's a few, of course, I wouldn't say there's none, but there's no widespread data sets that you can use in any context for any kind of research project and say, this is my disinformation data set. And I'll leave the floor now with the next speaker. But
Thank you very much, Michael. So we have, last but not least, the last two speakers of the day. We have Professor Dr. Tim Stucktai, who is an economist and executive director of the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security, also known as PIX, based in Germany. And since April 2025, Tim is also professor for the economics of cybersecurity at the German University of Digital Sciences. He oversees various research projects concerning civil security, and he also conducts his own research on cybersecurity economics and security policy. We also have Dr. Adelaide Baron-Kelly. She's also an economist with a PhD in institutions and policies from the Catholic University of Milan. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Economics and Statistics at the University of Turin and a senior research fellow at PIX. So both Tim and Adelaide contributed contributing in FERMI to develop the socioeconomic analyzer who tries to assess the economic impact of extremism online. So I will leave the floor to them and they will tell you more what they've been doing.
Thank you, Flavia. Let me start and then I will hand over the microphone to Adelaide. Just one, maybe for the beginning, you understand what it is that we were trying to do. You heard before Michael explaining basically how he was trying to measure the likelihood of a disinformation campaign online becoming a, let's say it in colloquial words, a real world problem in the physical world to become an actual crime. Because, well, we work closely together with law enforcement agencies and they don't care about disinformation unless it causes a crime. And as Michael was saying, there's lots of data around for crime statistics. But as you will see in a minute, sometimes getting access to it is difficult. So what we were trying to do at BICS, and here I echo what Spiros was saying at the beginning, FERMI was not about collecting data, it was about analyzing data. So what we were trying to do is to find out how from the disinformation campaign and the radicalization that is an effect of this disinformation campaign, how that is causing society actual economic costs. That was something that we were trying to calculate on a very granular geographic level in order to find some useful information for law enforcement agencies, how they could best allocate their resources. How should they divert their 100 policemen and women who work on preventing crime in between the various municipalities for which they are responsible. So, coming from Germany, we thought, great, as a proxy for radicalization, we use politically motivated crime. There's an entire statistic on it. And that statistic even differentiates between left-wing politically motivated crimes, right-wing, foreign, or religious motivated, politically motivated crimes. So at best, we might even be able to find out whether a particular kind of motivated crime is causing more costs to society than others. Yet, even though this great statistic is available, it is only available on the federal and on the state level in Germany. It, of course, exists also below on the what's called NUTS 3 level. However, that is classified because municipalities don't like it if they are known for being left-wing extremism prone or right-wing extremism prone. So for that reason, which is political, and I can absolutely understand that, this data is classified. However, thank you, BKA, the German Criminal Police, and also the Police College in Bavaria. We did get access to this after signing many non-disclosure agreements, so I will not show you the results, which German municipality is extremely right-wing or left-wing or whatever. But it was, after a while, possible to get access. But it took some time and it wasn't easy. That's one thing. So then, of course, with the results that we had, we were trying to look to see whether the results would be the same or similar in other European countries. So we started looking around whether we find similar data on politically motivated crime. The short answer is no. Then sometimes there is data, but that is collected not by the criminal police like in Germany, but by the domestic intelligence service. And so if I come as a German and say, look, I'm in this great European project, could you please give me your data on extremism in, I don't know, Finland, Sweden, Spain? No. That is very hard and it takes more than the 3 years that we had in the project. So I find it, let's say, weird. I find it weird that even though we say in Europe radicalization is a big issue, is a political issue that needs to be taken care of, yet we have very little data on it. And the data that we have is either fully classified because it lies with the intelligence services, or it's difficult to access, like in the German use case. However, we did find some similar data that we could also use as a proxy in Spain, and Adelaide will tell you a little more about it in a second, and then we can discuss how we can maybe find some more homogeneous data source for radicalization.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Well, first of all, let me stress that, again, that for us, for people like me and Tim that analyze the data, not having data, not having granulated data on extremism is a problem. And it is even more a problem because, as we are seeing today, extremism, radicalization is a big deal in Europe. So it was, I have to say that when I entered the FERMI project, it was quite a surprise to know that it was difficult to access the data because the data are there. Also, I had some discussion with the officer that told us, for example, they told us that some countries have data, granulated data on extremism, but they are not available. So, yeah, it was a surprise, but it also makes sense because if I goes to, from my experience, data on crime, and we are not talking about extremism, but on crime on a general level, are not harmonized data on crime, are not really available in Europe. It's the first research I did when I was a PhD student, even not a PhD student, a research assistant, was on murder. And I discovered that finding homogenized data on murder in all Europe, it's a challenge per se. So I let you imagine how difficult it is to find data about extremism, because one of the problems of extremism is that measuring extremism is really difficult. We had the benchmark from Germany. And so we looked at data that could be comparable from other countries. We failed for many of the pilot countries, but we managed to find data on eight crimes in Spain. 8 crimes is a big issue. Has became a big issue over the last 10, 15 years in Europe, and Spain decided to make public this data on 8 crimes over a 10-year period for all provinces and regions. So we found some data, but this data present 2 kinds of problems. The first one is they are difficult to aggregate because they are very granulated. I mean, we have data on 8 crimes categorized according very different type of crimes and different type of hate motivation. So any crime could consider an hate crime if there is a motivation. What does this mean practically? It means that I have 8 crimes for cybercrime. I have 8 crimes for crimes against the king. So I have 8 crimes for pedophiles. So it's really difficult to understand because it's a motivation that it adds to a type of crime. And I don't know whether I'm clear, but if you have questions, I'm happy to answer. Furthermore, I have a lot of possible motivation. So it's very detailed, this kind of data. It's very fluid. let me say in this way. So it was difficult to aggregate to make a consistent analysis. The other problem that we found an increase in hate crimes, a very steep increase in hate crimes over the 10 years period we had. Why? It could be that hate crimes are increasing, are dramatically increasing in Spain, or it could also be that the hate crimes have been underestimated 10 years ago, and now more police officers report a crime as an hate crime. So there could be an increase in the reporting of hate crimes, not in hate crimes per se. So, and finally, there was a last kind of problem. Compared to Germany, there was much fewer hate crimes in Spain, which could mean that Spain is a happy island and we have much more extremism in Germany, or it could be that there is still some sort of underreporting in Spain on this kind of crimes. So you see, when we use this when we use this data, it was very difficult for us to understand if these data were plausible. They were drawing a plausible pictures of hate crime in Spain, or there were some problems in the data. So it was a challenge to use them, but we used anyway because we wanted a second case to test our approach, and also because Spain was the only country we found data on reliable proxy on extremism. The other country, we contact Belgium, we contact France, we contact Sweden, and it was difficult to find usable data. We found some reports, but economists need time series, need a lot of data so that they can perform the analysis. So this was the story about Spanish data. And in the end, let me conclude with that. In the end, although our method, our approach is could be still perfected, we found some sort of correspondence in the economic cost of extremism in Germany and in Spain. This is not about results, it's more about the challenge of finding data, but in the end we can say that we found similar results in the two countries, and this was for us a good news. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers today. So I will say let's go a bit more into the specifics or your respective experience, research experiences in access to data for training AI models. So first of all, Spiros, you talked about accessing social media data. We know that there is an informational disbalance of power, of course, because the big techs own most of this data. There are ever-evolving and ever-changing API rules, so it's not always easy to access this data complying with their terms and conditions for access, even from a research perspective. Now, the European Union is trying to do something about it, but this is still clearly a problem. There are still difficulties. And over the day, we have also talked about how disinformation is ever-evolving. So different disinformation campaigns will have different facets, different characteristics. So in your experience, how did you manage to distinguish between content and data about content that was useful for your work in FERMI and all the white noise that is online? Because we have actual disinformation, we have bots, we have humans disseminating this information previously published by bots, we have satire, we have also genuine political discussions. So how did you manage to find data that was actually fit for purpose?
He is not unmuted, at least.
Spears, you have your mic off if you're there.
Yeah, but actually, I lost the sound for the last 40 seconds. Flavia, can you please repeat? I cannot hear you as well. No. Now I hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah. Now I can hear you very well.
Perfect. Okay. So I was mentioning that, of course, there is a difficulty in accessing social media data because of the changing API rules and the discrepancy owning these data, but of course the disinformation landscape is ever evolving, so there are always new narratives, always new types of content to analyze and understand. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you distinguished between actual data that are useful and fit for purpose for counter disinformation instruments and tools, and the noise that is online. So, for example, also genuine political conversation satire, but also disinformation that is not harmful per se. How did you make this distinction?
Actually, to be honest with you, let's say the nice part of the FERMI project is that we were not dealing at all with the so-called detection of fake news, right? This is what we also discussed with our project officer, and it was also, I assume, at least at this time, very clear to all of us that we were supposed to receive by verified fact checkers a post that was the initiation of a disinformation campaign. So we were analyzing this one, and to be honest with you, at least in data science, there are no so-called noisy data. Okay, everything contributes. Everything is all data is very important for the narrative, for the analysis, and the monitoring of the disinformation campaigns. In more technical terms, okay, we were actually gathering, we were collecting from the social media platforms everything that has to do with the post, like the interactions in terms of reposting, resharing, posting with a comment, including any of the emotions of the available on the social media platform, and so on. And we were categorizing them, creating a graph where, in a way, we were demonstrating the connection, the so-called subgraph, if we consider that the whole network is the full graph. And then we were trying with advanced graph analytics to analyze the spread, the propagation of these false narratives.
Thank you very much, Spears, for elaborating a little bit of this more technical aspect of your research. And now I would like to ask a question to Michael, because you mentioned that you use data from publicly available datasets in the US. So this was already mentioned today over the course of the conference, that the US is somehow better in information sharing. So we will just we'll have to take example more often when it comes to using and providing data to researchers to allow them to do their work. But you also mentioned cultural and linguistic differences that are really crucial in anti-disinformation efforts. So how did you make sure in your research that these data from the US were still contextually aware when it came to your research? There were any obstacles to it?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, Europe and the United States are obviously not the same, but the great part about the United States is also the states are not the same. So within the US, you have so many different cultural, economic realities. I mean, they do have a unifying language, but otherwise they're very divided as a people, how they live their lives, the cultures they have. And so we tried to get the widest sample possible. I think it was mentioned earlier, we used, I think it was 30 cities and 1 county from across the entire United States. We tried to be as wide-reaching as we could. And in the early stages of the research, what we did is a technique called clustering. So we collected different attributes from the Census Bureau of the United States, such as household income levels, employment levels, in the years that were relevant to the model we trained. And we tried to see, okay, if we're going to cluster these different cities together, are all the American cities going to group together, or they're going to be dispersed? And we saw that there are different ones. Some are similar to each other, but they're rather different. And then we brought in European cities. We didn't have the crime data for all these cities, but we did have from Eurostat these socioeconomic variables, and we clustered. And we saw sometimes European cities were grouping closer to American cities than other European cities. So we adopted a general approach that if the model can learn about the phenomenon itself, how these two things relate, how this nexus exists between online disinformation and offline crime, then we can take that information about the phenomena and bring it into the European context. And like I said, we were able to use European crime data, which the missing link for us to do everything in Europe was not crime data, it was disinformation data. So when the model actually predicts, we give it information about past crime from Europe. So it understands how crime has been flowing in a certain European country, and then it produces the prediction with a weight on the relationship that it's learned from the United States. So how crime and disinformation will interact comes from the American context, but the crime it sees occurring is European crime. So it knows the trends here when it makes a prediction.
Thank you very much, Michael. So actually a successful story of how some difference between the US and Europe could be reconciled, at least in the context of the FERMI research. Yet we see that harmonization is also a problem inside Europe. We still have lots of differences in the definition of extremism, politically motivated crimes, as Tim and Adelaide explained to us earlier. So I would like to ask you, and whoever wants can take this question, how do you see overcoming this problem in the future? Do you think that some technical solutions, such as federated learning, for example, can help overcoming these differences in the legal definitions of politically motivated crimes? So, for example, using data that come from different sources, of course, that come from different legislations, in spite of the fact that the phenomenon, the underlying phenomenon can still be different. So do you think there is a technical solution to it, or a policy-oriented solution to it will be better?
So I'll start, and then maybe Adelaide continues. So first of all, I think what is required is the political willingness to accept that extremism, radicalization is a phenomenon that needs to be measured. That is a political question that each single country or the EU Commission needs to decide about, that this is the kind of data that we need and that we want. Then the second step would be, okay, how differentiated do we want or need this data? Not because I'm German myself, but I like the German approach where you even differentiate between different kinds of extremism. But as you imply in your question, not only US states are different and have different cultures, but of course in Europe we do too. And one example clearly is, take for example, Holocaust denial, which in this country is a crime. In other countries, it's part of freedom of speech. Other countries in Europe, it's part of freedom of speech. So we have different laws, and therefore the statistics differ. And if I may make the final point, and so after agreeing on a way how to collect data and measuring what you want to measure, what you want to manage, and that is extremism and radicalization, it is ultimately down to the individual policeman or woman to decide which box do I check. And I give you an example that is not so unrealistic. If you have an Israeli tourist who gets knocked down in Berlin and gets his iPhone stolen by someone who later turns out to be a Lebanese national with Palestinian heritage, which box do you check? Is it an ordinary burglary because the iPhone got stolen? Is it left-wing extremism because maybe the guy was also wearing an Antifa t-shirt? Is it religiously motivated? Is it foreign motivated? Or because it's against a Jew, it's always right-wing? Oversimplifying. So it very much depends on the individual cop to say, okay, I think given what I know, I check this box. So the data will never be perfect, but at least we need to start realizing that we need a homogeneous approach within the European Union to take the problem serious and start collecting data and making it available.
I agree with him. At least we should be aware that there is a gap in research and in data collection. Okay, I think that we can sum up your question with 2 words: culture and political motivation. I realize studying crime data that defining a crime in a way it's always something cultural. I told you about homicide, the way homicide is defined, there is a lot of cultural issue, and this could be said also for sexual crimes. So there is always some cultural part that depends on the country that is defining the crime. I know you are a jurist, so you should know. It depends also from the law system of the country. So it's I don't believe in such a thing as federated learning, but I believe in, and I'm going to my second words, to political motivation. Why we have some homogenized data around the world, because we have the World Bank, for example, or we have Eurostat. So in order to have harmonized data, we need some sort of political policy action that allow us to collect this kind of data in the same way. So we
of protocols.
Exactly. We have data on GDP because we need data on GDP is the base for all the economics analysis. So, and I think that the same should be done for crime data. I mean, we should have, is extremism a problem for all of Europe? The question is yes, no. If it's yes, then there should be some, I would say, unified action so that we collect the same data. I think that other ways, I'm extremely cynical. I think that you have something because there is no need to have something. And in the case of extremism, we need data, and I think that we'll need this data over the following years. Then the action should come.
Thank you very much. So I have many more questions, but I will now stop monopolizing the floor and open the floor to the audience instead. So if there are any questions, both here in person or online, please.
Thank you for the presentations. They raise a number of issues to me, but let's maybe start with a very broad one. It seems to me that the GDPR is a considerable obstacle to obtaining data, and even data which is not inherently necessary when it is obviously personal. It may preclude some data being collected. The question I have is, has the impact of the GDPR been analyzed it has on this kind of research and the potential damage it does or lack of benefit that could be attributed to the GDPR, and therefore propose some amendments to GDPR that could overcome this?
Put us in a moral dilemma now. because the person who is in charge of data protection is the moderator. So whatever we answer will be closely monitored by her and then later evaluated. So let me try and tightrope here by answering your question. So first of all, the problem, at least that Adelaide and I ran into, was not a GDPR problem per se. It was classified data, but it was classified because for, let's say, political reasons, just that municipalities did not want it to be known that they have a right-wing problem, that they have a left-wing problem or an Islamist problem. So here, personal data did only play a role when, luckily, sometimes the numbers are so low that you can more or less say, okay, there was this one left-wing incident in the municipality of, I don't know, Ostral-Scharnbeck, and you can easily follow, because there was a media report about it, was it, Tim hitting someone for whatever reason. So then it becomes a GDPR issue. But in general, of course, people like us like to have as much data as humanly possible, anonymized, pseudonymized, whatever. We're perfectly fine. I don't need to know that Michael was arrested in Miami. I just need to know why someone, maybe in his age group and with his gender, was arrested for what in Miami. And this kind of data, of course, is for our kind of research extremely helpful and sometimes difficult to access. Will you let me live now?
I think I will. But actually, I wanted to ask the other two speakers, three actually, if they have something to add about the GDPR issue.
Something to say, because they wrestled with it more than anyone else. But yeah, I mean, with what we did, we didn't really have to deal with the GDPR because, of course, we shifted to the American context. But in some ways, seeing how detailed the American data is and how much information was there, even the residential address number where something happened, I feel like it's better that we have it, and as researchers have to wrestle with it and try and overcome it as a barrier than not to have it and have people's data so evidently exposed. But as like Tim was saying, there's a happy medium where, what I did in Miami doesn't have to be attached to my name, but it's there in a data set for someone to use. So we have to kind of find a happy medium between protecting people's information, which we need to do, and allowing us to create the insights we need to advance society and advance research.
Spiros, do you want to add something?
No, Flavia, I think that we are fully covered on the topic, and I truly hope that we have conveyed most of the experience that we gained during the FERMI project into the audience.
Please.
Following on from this question of GDPR, I imagine that a lot of the concerns could probably be avoided through anonymization, as was said. And I think the same probably applies to municipalities in Germany as well. And still, we can't find a way around this.
Obviously, we did find a way around it, but it was a very long and complicated way that, let's say, cost a lot of transaction cost to, find the right person. And again, thank you to the right person at BKA that ultimately made it possible. But it took a while to find that person and to figure out what was needed in order to get there. Plus, it is still very complicated because it's not just that, we have this data file and Adelaide can play with it on with the statistical or econometric software she uses. No, we have to physically go there, go into a windowless room where there's a a separated computer where we can run our problems, our algorithms. So that is complicated. And if you know a little bit how data scientists, econometricians work, you often have small little mistakes in your data sets, and you need to rerun this. And if you always have to return and go to Wiesbaden again in order to do so, that's just complicated. So yeah, if anybody is a genie here, so the wish would be to make that easier, to get easier access to it. But again, I do understand that if you are the mayor of Wolfsburg, well, I guess everyone knows that they have an Islamist problem, but because they can read the newspaper, but maybe you don't want the statistics to demonstrate that, yes, the problem is real.
My last question, which is, are there any loopholes inside the EU between different member states that could be exploited in inverted commas? I'm aware of the fact that, for instance, in Italy, it's perfectly legal to publish persecution of individual mafia cases or with the names, whereas you could not here in Germany publish a legal case against a mafioso. So we have within the EU, we have different I won't call it standards, but at least the rules, is a way of using those to the benefit of getting better research results.
Sorry. Once again, for us, at least for us economists, maybe Michael could say it something different. It's not important the name, but the observation. So it's for if we know that there was 2 arrests for mafia in a city in Germany and 2 arrests for mafia in a city in Italy, for us having this information anonymized, it's okay. It's perfectly okay. It's really, we really don't care about these differences. What we care is about, for example, if for mafia, for organized criminality, you have a definition in Germany and you have a definition in Italy, which is very different, which include different crimes. Well, that's a problem for us because we cannot compare that. I cannot put them together and analyze the impact of organized criminality in Europe because it's very difficult to have that. So I have to analyze every country separately. So for us, this is a problem, the lack of homogenization in definition, not that much the issue of the names. It could be exploited in journalistic terms. I mean, it could be exploited for that kind of a qualitative research, having a name. But for the kind of research, the quantitative research we do, it's not really important.
Maybe just one very general observation. We are, as academic scientists, we always find a way. It's a question of how long does it take, how much effort does it take, and how much do you lose by finding a workaround. So, for example, you can use data sets from the United States. And economists, for example, often use text data from the US because it's so beautifully available. You can download it in CVS format. And therefore, a lot of research that is sponsored by the European taxpayer uses data from other countries. The same thing was true when red genetic research was an issue here. the people from this university traveled to South Korea, to China, Israel, and did that kind of research. You did your theoretical work here, and then you travel elsewhere. So there are always loopholes. But on the other hand, the regulator is trying to put, let's say, European values to the regulation, and we say, no, certain kind of personalized data should not be available to the law enforcement community, not available to third parties, and especially not available to then you have to wait and balance the different needs. Do I want personalized medicine? And the word says it. You need personalized data for personalized medicine. Can I work around it with pseudonymization and anonymization? Or is that impossible? Then we have to just find our way. But it's important to have that debate. What's the additional benefit from, let's say, more personalized data? And if we, as academics, can prove that we have a reasonable hope that there is a benefit that is not possible with the current regulation, then we have to make that. And then Flavia will help us change the regulation if needed.
Something just on a broad consideration. Sometimes the data I really would like to have, sometimes the data that I really would like to have is not about people, but it's about countries. So sometimes I don't have data that a country should make available. So it's sometimes really, I think that the motivation because some data are not made available is political, it's not about personal data. So I'm an expert in arms trade, so I would like more data about arms trade.
Russian arms especially.
Especially, yes. And so you see, in that case, it's not the people privacy that is protected by the country privacy, on which I have less consideration and less concern.
But perhaps a reflection on my side, since many of us have been in security research and in security policy since some time, and data on security and the security policies like no other policy. It is highly politicized, very sensitive, but at the same time very, very important. Now, I would not picture now GDPR as a major barrier. Of course, as every legislation has some very good effects and some also non-intended side effects. But I wouldn't raise an eyebrow there because this applies to every legislation, which appeared in the second half of the 19th century. Think about the etymology of the word. Statistics has been the state science and was focusing primarily on demographics. So state authorities were doing statistics in order to get a grasp of what's going on here in our country. This is how it all started. Jumping back to 2021, when the Commission launched the resilience dashboards, which are disaggregated in 5 categories. Very few people know about that. The European Commission wanted to receive, and still wants to receive, from all 27 member states data along very many composite indicators in order to get a grasp. Where do we stand? Are we going like that or are we going up? That thing, huh? And again, I mean, we are speaking about macro data, not ideographic micro data, so to speak. This has gone so far, after 4 years, half well, because at best, ministries, because they collect data from governments and for very many ministries, have been sending the data, I mean, of course, again, We should not be surprised, incomplete after 2 years, and so on. Now, this is the reality which is in contrast, and I'm giving that as a reflection, let us say, to a big Asian state, which does not value stuff such as GDPR very much. They collect data wildly without asking you, so to speak. They have a much better grasp of what is going on. Huh? So this is the good thing. Of course, they can misuse it very easily as well on the other side. But these are decisions, political decisions of what do we want to collect in order to do what. Huh? And this is a governmental decision so that we get a better grasp of reality, particularly when we deal with issues which we dub as threats. So I think this would be the political message, because the science can deliver results after a certain time, after a long study. However, some major issues raised today during the day, this is my takeaway, are purely political, so to speak, and scientists may not much there. So probably these are some messages to policy here, what we need, not in order for us to do our job, but much more for them to do their job, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And since we're almost out of time, we came back to politics and policy. Adelaide and team already told us quite extensively that they would like more extensively that they would like a political will to harmonize protocols to access certain data, so collect data, harmonize them in a way that makes them more accessible to researchers. This does not necessarily mean they have to be they have to refer to specific individuals, but they should be available and harmonized at a European level. If you want to add something more, of course, you're welcome to. But I would like to ask also Spiros and Michael if they have some takeaway and what's their takeaway in terms of policies to make access to data easier and better for the future in disinformation-related research. So I will hand the mic to Michael and then Spiros.
In a sense, we want to take advantage of them. I'm speaking more to machine learning, AI-based models and technologies. We want to take advantage of them. But before we do that, we have to kind of set a foundation of data that allows for these models to be trained accurately. In a sense, we've kind of jumped the gun in some ways. I'm speaking us as in Europe, and we've asked for these technologies, but we haven't prepared the data that's necessary to train them. As it's been said maybe 10, 12 times today, these models are only as good as the data that goes into them. So first, we have to prepare the data, and it has to become more granular, it has to become more accurate, and it has to be better reflecting reality if we want to create AI models that then we can employ in the real world. So it's like my takeaway is we have to do things one step at a time. The conversation in these first years should have been, how do we advance the data picture, the data landscape of Europe? How do we, for instance, mirror something like what they have in the United States with the Universal Crime Reporting Program, which has gone on since 1930, where they've been insisting police agencies across the country use one format, use one crime code system. Even if they have different criminal law, they have to apply the national code when it's available. So, that's the first conversation to be had. How do we harmonize data across Europe? And then how can we exploit this data to advance our technological capacity?
Very much, Michael. Spiros, you mentioned during your presentation about evolving regulatory landscape in Europe, the DSA, the fact that you it's not there yet. Okay. Then in this case, we will just have to get in contact with him to know his final takeaway. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Give them a round of applause, please, because I think they deserve it.
Some final thoughts by you.
Okay, thank you everybody for your time and for all of your remarks. Thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for hanging in here. Thanks for carving out time to join us online. I think that's been truly remarkable and insightful. It's been a great pleasure to listen to everything that's been said, to all of the presentations that have been held. I'll have a go at making some concluding remarks, and don't worry, I don't mean to ramble for too long. I mean to speak for the sake of speaking, so I'm not going to filibuster. One of the things I've learned is that in heavily politicized environments like this one, the most dangerous place one can possibly get stuck in is the one between a distinguished audience and something to drink. So no worries, I'll try to keep it brief. As I said this morning, the purpose of this gathering has been threefold. So we've addressed the threat landscape, listened to overviews of disinformation campaigns rooted in Russia trying to influence the elections that were held in Germany this year. The presentation on the impact of numerous disinformation campaigns on the cohesion in Sweden. And lastly, a presentation on the role trust can play and the importance of trust in mitigating disinformation threats. So that was the first pillar of the gathering, the threat landscape. As I was listening to the presentations that were given this morning and the conversations that took place subsequently, I thought that disinformation efforts, well, first of all, it really gave us an overview of the multi-layered threat that we're up against. As I said, we in the FERMI project, we analyzed the impact of disinformation on crime. So that's one thing, one challenge. On the other hand, and I guess that's something that one gets a much better idea of if one is following what the media reports about, is that disinformation can have an impact on domestic stability and on the cohesion of society and on democracy as such. So that gets back to what Julia said about the disinformation, the Russian disinformation efforts to influence the elections in Germany. So those are two different pillars, or those are two different threats. And it's not just Russia. We listened to a great presentation on Russia, but other disinformation efforts have been undertaken by other foreign players. China is a case in point, Iran, what have you. It's not just one player, there are many of them. So within the realm of the foreign manipulation efforts or the FERMI threats, you have many different players that pursue numerous different interests and that engage in many different tactics to cause harm to not just the European Union, but Western societies at large. Okay, so that's one pillar. Then there's the impact of disinformation on the crime landscape. And I called it a great presentation on the impact of disinformation on the cohesion of the Swedish society. As we addressed, or as we learned a little bit later on when Tim and Adelaide were talking about the politically motivated crime data, or the challenge of getting their hands on politically motivated crime data, it became obvious that that threat is also multi-layered. There are numerous different dimensions to the threat of disinformation and the nexus between disinformation on crime. It's not just one field. There's right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism. In Germany, also religiously motivated extremism and foreign-rooted extremism. So many different forms of extremism that can translate into different forms of crime. So the more deeper dive you take into the subject matter, the more obvious it becomes how complex the threat is and what needs to be done, or how much needs to be done to counter it successfully. So that's one rather depressing takeaway. There is a multitude of threats and a multitude of actors we need to keep our eyes on, and we need to monitor quite closely. So more specifically, as I was listening to Julia's presentation on the disinformation threat being rooted in Russian efforts to destabilize, in particular Germany, also the Western world at large, it occurred to me that those campaigns, obviously, and she mentioned the efforts to harm other parties, that take a rather tough stance on Russia and to support the AfD and also others like the BSW that were inclined to be supportive of Russia. And those campaigns can have different dimensions too, or pursue different strategies, in the sense that one of them, the doppelganger campaign, barely mentioned the AfD or other rather pro-Russian forces. They were just aimed at bashing all of the others, whereas the Storm campaign, or Storm 1516, deliberately spread false claims about AfD votes being shredded, to elections being stolen, quite a popular narrative amongst some extreme right-wing activists. If you think of Donald Trump efforts to portray the 22 presidential election as being stolen from him. So that has not only cast a bad light on the political establishment, it also cast a very positive light on the AfD, in the sense that they are the ones, or they were portrayed as a decent player, unlike all of the others that seem to have engaged in a conspiracy to undermine democracy and to steal the election, or at least to undermine the of the AfD. So there are different ways to get messages across that all aim at supporting certain players that are in favor of foreign entities. That's another takeaway. And we learned that, I think, very clearly as we were listening to Julia's presentation. And I'm sure the same applies to Julia's presentation on Russia, but I'm sure the same applies to foreign manipulation efforts and FEMI campaigns undertaken by other players. Again, it's not just Russia. There's also China, I think the second biggest player in the disinformation game, and there's Iran and many, many others. We cannot even name them all. So that's another takeaway. As I was listening to Carl, it occurred to me that there are not just numerous different disinformation campaigns taking place in Sweden that can undermine the cohesion of Swedish society, but even within those campaigns, and you mentioned the Quran burnings, so apparently those were tailored to a far-right audience. But simultaneously, they also mobilized Islamist players, because of course they took huge offense at the Quran burnings. So you can engage in inflammatory action on the term and fan the flames of sectarian tensions. And it can go either way. You can mobilize your base, reach out to your supporters, and ensure that those radicalize, but the other side that you demonize, they radicalize as well. So that's another takeaway. Disinformation campaigns can have multiple consequences, and they can impact different audiences. They can escalate quite quickly. Also, Carl, you mentioned the importance of strategic communication. That was one of the key takeaways that you laid out. I think that was directly related, or that was a great segue to the follow-up presentation by Panayotia, who mentioned the importance of trust and the importance of messaging. As I was listening to both of you, I was like, okay, it seems the challenge is not just to figure out what's going wrong and how to push back. It also is about finding the right message. And related to that, I think we also need to find the right messengers. In particular, Panayotia said that verification matters and that trust matters. I think those two might be intertwined in the sense that if people have trust in institutions, they're also likely to have trust in the verification efforts undertaken by those in charge of keeping an eye on disinformation efforts and revealing them and calling them out and dismantling them if necessary. What I was going to say is that you have the challenge of finding the right message to push back against disinformation efforts, but you also need to find the right messenger to get that message across to those disinformation campaigns are tailored to. And that's something we've learned in different contexts. That's one of the key takeaways from the studies of radicalization and terrorism. It's one thing to find out what a radicalized crowd, for example, a crowd of radical Islamists, needs to know or needs to learn to de-radicalize. It's an entirely different challenge to find the right person or the right group to communicate that to them in a manner that resonates with them. I think the same applies to, obviously, politically motivated extremists that are motivated by disinformation campaigns. So I think that's something we need to keep an eye on. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into account if we lay out recommendations as to how we might push back on disinformation efforts. Then in the second panel, we listened to 3 great demonstrations on the platforms that were being developed in the framework of 3 different EU-funded research projects, our own, so I'm quite biased, I'm quite open about it, not going to lie about that. The FERMI platform, which again, and that goes back to what I just said about the multitude of the threat we're up against. That was also quite well illustrated by the demos that were being held. Because our platform, the FERMI platform, is of course aimed at an entirely different audience. It is for law enforcement agencies. It is aimed at helping them investigating illicit activities taking place on social media. Whereas the 2 other demos, one of the Vera AI platform and the one on the Athena platform, have different target audiences, or the platforms have different target audiences. And so we have the projects. So those platforms are tailored to journalists and fact checkers, etc. So they approach the disinformation threat from a different angle. Unlike ourselves, they do detection. They are meant to figure out what disinformation activities are going on and figuring out if pieces of claims or news that are being shared happen to be true or false, which is something that we don't do at all because we run counter to what law enforcement agencies are allowed to do or not. In that context, the question was asked by Carl, the other Carl, German Carl, about whether or not it wouldn't make sense to feed our platform not with a piece of disinformation, if I remember correctly, but with a piece of accurate information, or at least something that one would not expect to trigger an escalation in the crime landscape. So, and again, that was sort of a great segue, though unintentionally, to the third panel, because it led to a discussion of the complexities of examining this information. Because the idea, which I find very thought-provoking and reasonable, made me wonder, okay, I really see the upsides to doing that, but are we allowed to do that? Can we have our law enforcement agencies do that? Or would they have second thoughts about that and say, well, from an academic standpoint or a technical standpoint, that's quite a reasonable thing to do. Are we allowed to use data? Is that part of the research mandate we have? If our objective is to study the impact of illicit disinformation claims, well, we might argue, well, basically yes, because it's aimed at figuring out how well our platform can do just that, by figuring out if our platform can distinguish or makes different predictions, depending on whether or not it is fed with an illicit piece of disinformation, or a claim that does not constitute such a piece of disinformation at all, and one would therefore not expect to lead to an escalation in the crime landscape. But then there's the other issue. Then there are the laws law enforcement agencies are bound by in accordance with the legal landscape of the countries they reside in. Because law enforcement agencies are required to investigate criminal activities. Are they allowed to monitor the internet? Are they allowed to feed platforms they are developing or developing? Platforms are being developed by technicians, but they are tested by our law enforcement agency partners. Are allowed to do that by feeding such platforms with posts that fall way outside of their mandate? Would that be possible? I'm just asking these questions because I have second thoughts about whether or not we're allowed to go there. Again, I understand why you're asking the question. See the upsides to doing that. In the project, we didn't go there because we weren't quite sure we were allowed to go there, and we wanted to make sure that we're in full compliance with the general data protection regulations, data minimization principle. So to be on the safe side, we didn't want to analyze or process any data we weren't quite sure we were allowed to process. So just saying, it's a fair question, it's a good point, but if you study it, if you examine it, if you ponder it, you immediately run into all the complexities, not just practically, but also legally, as to whether or not you can use what you would be, what would seem a reasonable thing to do. Again, from an academic, from a logical, and from a technical standpoint. And that was also what we touched upon in the third panel. Although it was not so much about, or not entirely about, the legal complexities, it was more broadly about the challenges of getting access to the data that is required to do the research that we need to develop the solutions, or to fine-tune the solutions that were presented beforehand, and to fully mitigate the threat landscape that was discussed in the first panel. So more specifically, we listened to presentations on the challenges of getting access and to analyze social media data, disinformation data, and crime data. That obviously that was not entirely new to me. If it was, I guess I would have already failed as part of the coordination team. But one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that we've had different experiences when it comes to getting access to crime, depending on what crime data we needed. So, for example, Michael reported that when he was working on the nexus between disinformation and crime, the crime data was not the problem. The problem was, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, the problem was finding the matching disinformation data sets. They got the crime data from the law enforcement agency partners involved in the project. So then, speaking of the disinformation data sets, there's a whole set of other challenges that I'm not going to get into greater detail. Like, for example, what constitutes disinformation, etc. What language is the disinformation that might resonate with an audience in a certain country, etc. Again, the crime data was not the problem when it comes to studying the nexus between disinformation and crime. But the crime data was the problem, or getting access to the crime data was the problem in the context of politically motivated crime. Because that crime data was either was measured entirely differently, because not all countries involved in the project were having the same, well, I would say clarity, for lack of a better word, or were as eager as others to develop data sets as profound and as substantive as the German ones. Because in Germany, as Tim and Adelaide explained, we have quite clear data sets on politically motivated crime distinguished between different categories. Not all countries in Europe have that. And that's, of course, a very important takeaway in the policy recommendation we can come up with in the FERMI project. Why not standardize? In Europe, we standardize so many things. Why not standardize politically motivated crime data, which would make it a lot easier, not just for projects like ours, to research the impacts of crime or the root causes of crime and the nexus between disinformation and crime, politically motivated crime to be exact. It would also give all law enforcement agency efforts to coordinate their efforts to fight politically motivated crime across Europe a huge shot in the arm, because it would make things so much easier. It would enable law enforcement agencies and other agencies like domestic intelligence agencies involved in such activities to coordinate way more clearly and more easily, because they will have a common basis they could build such efforts on. So that's a key takeaway. And again, totally different experiences when it comes to getting access to crime data, depending on what crime data was needed. General crime data was easily available. Data on politically motivated crime was not just because it was defined differently, or politically motivated crime was defined differently, or researched differently, or processed and analyzed differently across Europe, also because there are classification issues. Oftentimes, the data, if available, happens to be classified. That's another problem we face as a research community. That's not a problem the expert community faces, because if you have a clearance, you have access to such data. As researchers, we need to face the dire reality of not having that access. And if we do, we are very unlikely to be allowed to use our access for research purposes, or at least in the context of a EU project where all the specifics or all the details of such information would be shared with all partners. So that's a challenge that requires a workaround. Workarounds need to be found by finding solutions such as not making set data available to all partners, but analyzing it, be it in closed room or windowless room at the German Federal Criminal Office or what have you. We found other proxies or solutions, creative solutions, like using American disinformation data as a proxy, if there is no equivalent in Europe. And also when it comes to social media data, which is of course a key prerequisite. You have access to social media data if you want to develop a platform that examines the ramifications of social media disinformation campaigns. But how do you do that? Virtually all social media platforms have greatly restricted their access to social media data, so-called API data. And again, it wasn't easy to find a workaround enabling us to achieve our goals. And what we did is we practically aimed for the lowest hanging fruit by using the available data, available in a limited form and for a limited time, but at least available, enabling us to train the platform, to test the platform, and to finalize and complete the platform. So tons of different challenges and tons of problems, but as complicated as they are, to end on a rather uplifting note, because otherwise this would be a rather depressing set of concluding remarks. The good thing is that there is, as complicated as those challenges are and as different as the problems are that we are facing, there is a possibility to supplement each other's work. Again, that goes back to what we saw in session 2. We can develop different platforms that can supplement each other, platforms for fact checkers and journalists, enabling them to distinguish between true or false, detecting disinformation, and other platforms for law enforcement agencies, enabling another target audience to take the proper countermeasures. And whilst those platforms need to be different in scope and need to include different tools, they also include elements that might be of interest to other target audiences or target audiences the platforms may not be immediately tailored to. Even though a platform may be tailored to journalists and fact checkers, it might still be of interest to LEAs, at least to a certain degree, or at least certain tools thereof. So platforms that can supplement each other, developed in projects that got funded under different calls. We got funded under fighting crime and terrorism call, for example. Apparently, our target audience is the law enforcement agency community. That does not mean that all of our tools cannot be used, cannot be exploited by other players too. If you think of the spread analyzer figuring out the spread of a disinformation post, how it travels around, that is not necessarily limited to investigating a disinformation campaign that happens to be illegal or that includes illegal messaging. That's something that other players might take advantage of as well. For example, private sector players want to figure out how a disinformation campaign harming their interest has traveled and who's been involved in sharing it, how influential the players sharing it have been. And of course, the same applies to other platforms not aimed at the LEA community, but tailored to journalists and fact checkers, which may include, as we discussed, with regards to the Vera AI platform and the Athena platform, which may include parts and tools and components that might be of interest to the law enforcement agency community as well, even though the law enforcement agency community is not the primary addressee of their tools. So as you can hear, my voice is going, so I guess I need to wrap this up, and all of you are eager to grab something to drink like myself. Let me just say in closing that the key takeaway is that the challenge seems to be to find the right balance between developing platforms and tools and engage in efforts that supplement each other, but always to be mindful of the commonalities we have, which might set us on the path towards making the best of the research efforts we've engaged in the different projects, so the tools and platforms can be exploited as successfully as possible. And the reason I'm emphasizing this, and for those of you that are not involved in FERMI, we'll have a consortium meeting tomorrow where exploitation will feature quite prominently on our agenda, which is what you always do once you're done with the project. You ponder, okay, what can you do with the outputs? How can you exploit those? How can you commercialize those? And one of the things I really learned, not just whilst listening to the presentations, but also numerous side conversations I was having with some of you, is that the interest in what we've done in our tools greatly exceeds the target audience that we've been having in mind. We are a fighting crime and terrorism project. Our tools are mostly tailored to LEAs, law enforcement agencies, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be exploited by others as well. And that's something that I think we should all keep in mind, and we should take into consideration when we fine-tune our exploitation efforts. And I very much hope that we'll stay in touch with not just those of you that are involved in FERMI, but also those of you that have come here who may not be working for law enforcement agencies, but that have shown their interest in what we've done, and who might have expressed their interest in the outputs of our project. And I very much hope we can keep up with you, that you may follow us on social media, and if you've exchanged business cards and we come across an idea that might be of interest to you, we are very happy to inform you about where we might take it from there and how we might turn this three-year-long journey, which has been a remarkable one, and I thank everybody who's been part of it, into a broader journey or another journey, including other travelers that might be by our side as we take it from where we are right now. So thanks again to the BIX team for organizing this. Thanks to Katarina for disseminating this. Thanks to all of you for coming here and showing your interest. And I hope we've turned all of you into strong FERMI supporters. In case you haven't had enough, again, please check out our website and our dissemination material. We'll do whatever we can to make all of you drink our Kool-Aid as we now engage in our exploitation efforts, which we're going to discuss in greater detail tomorrow at the consortium meeting. All right, so thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.